The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Astoria Palace as Prince Alexander stood before the golden doors of the throne room. His jaw was set with determination, and his emerald eyes held a fire that had been building for weeks. Today would change everything. Inside the vast throne room, King Leopold sat rigid on his ancient throne, the weight of centuries pressing down through the carved stone. His gray eyes, cold as winter steel, watched his eldest son approach. The courtiers lining the walls sensed the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm. Prince Alexander had spent sleepless nights preparing for this moment. At 28, he was no longer the obedient boy who once hung on his father's every word. The kingdom of Valdoria was suffering while the royal family lived in luxury behind palace walls. Villages were struggling with failing crops, merchants couldn't afford the heavy taxes, and young people were leaving the kingdom in droves, seeking opportunities elsewhere. "Your Majesty," Alexander began, his voice carrying across the polished floor. He refused to call him father in this formal setting, knowing it would set the tone for what was to come. King Leopold's fingers tightened imperceptibly on the armrests of his throne. He had ruled Valdoria for 35 years, with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, every decision calculated, every tradition upheld, every challenge to his authority swiftly crushed. He had molded this kingdom into what it was through discipline and unwavering adherence to royal protocol. "Prince Alexander," the king acknowledged, his voice devoid of warmth. "You requested a formal audience. Speak." The prince took a deep breath. Around him, he could feel the eyes of dozens of courtiers, ministers, and guards. Lord Chancellor Reginald stood to the king's right, his thin lips pressed together in disapproval. He already knew what was coming. Alexander had made the mistake of confiding in someone he thought was an ally. "The people of Valdoria are suffering," Alexander stated clearly. "Our treasury overflows, while families go hungry. Our merchants are crushed under taxes, while we feast on imported delicacies. This cannot continue." Quote, a murmur rippled through the court. No one spoke to the king this way. Even Queen Isabella, watching from her smaller throne beside her husband, shifted uncomfortably. "The kingdom prospers under my rule," King Leopold replied, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You speak of matters you do not fully understand." "I understand perfectly," Alexander shot back, stepping closer to the throne. "I've spent months traveling through our provinces, disguised as a common merchant. I've seen what you refuse to see from this throne. Children begging in streets, farmers selling their lands to pay taxes. Our people don't prosper, they merely survive." The king's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over mountains. "You traveled in disguise? Without royal permission? Without protection?" "I needed to see the truth," Alexander replied. "The truth that's hidden from us by ministers who only show us what we want to see." Lord Chancellor Reginald stepped forward. "Your Highness, such accusations are..." "Accurate," Alexander interrupted, turning to face the Chancellor. "When was the last time you set foot outside the capital, Reginald? When did you last speak to a farmer? A blacksmith? A mother trying to feed her children?" The Chancellor's face flushed red. But before he could respond, King Leopold rose from his throne. The entire court fell silent. When the king stood, everyone listened. "You dare question my rule?" Leopold's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "You dare suggest that I, who have guided this kingdom through war and peace, do not know what is best for my people?" "I'm suggesting that times have changed," Alexander replied, refusing to back down even as his heart hammered in his chest. "The old ways no longer serve us. We need reform. We need to open the treasury, reduce taxes, invest in education and infrastructure. We need to..." "Enough," the king's voice boomed through the throne room. "You forget yourself, boy. You are not king. You have no authority to make demands." "Then give me authority," Alexander said, and gasps echoed through the court. "Name me crown prince officially. Give me the power to implement reforms. Let me prove that there's a better way." The silence that followed was deafening. Queen Isabella's knuckles were white as she gripped her throne. Courtiers exchanged shocked glances. No one had ever been so bold with King Leopold. The king descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing like thunder. He stopped mere inches from his son, and despite being nearly 60, Leopold still cut an imposing figure. Years of sword training in his youth had left him strong, and his presence was overwhelming. "You want to be crown prince?" Leopold asked softly. "You want power?" "I want to help our people," Alexander replied, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. "Power," the king continued as if his son hadn't spoken, "is not given. It is earned. It is held by those strong enough to wield it without breaking." "You think you understand leadership because you walked among peasants for a few months?" "I think I understand compassion," Alexander retorted. "Something this throne has forgotten." The slap came without warning. The king's hand connected with his son's cheek with enough force to snap Alexander's head to the side. The sound echoed through the throne room like a whip crack. Alexander tasted blood where his teeth had cut his cheek. He slowly turned back to face his father, his eyes blazing with defiance rather than submission. "You will return to your chambers," King Leopold commanded. "You will remain there until I decide what to do with you." Guards. 2 royal guards stepped forward, but Alexander raised his hand. "No need," he said quietly. "I'll go willingly. But this isn't over." "It is over when I say it is over," the king replied coldly. "You are my son, but you are also my subject. Never forget that." Alexander turned and walked toward the doors, his back straight despite the humiliation. As he passed the assembled courtiers, he noticed something unexpected. Some of them, particularly the younger ones, were looking at him not with disapproval, but with something approaching admiration. Lady Catherine, the Minister of Agriculture's daughter, even gave him the slightest nod. Behind him, he heard his father's voice ring out. "Let this be a lesson to all. I am king. My word is law. Anyone who challenges my authority will face the consequences, whether they share my blood or not." But as Alexander left the throne room, he didn't feel defeated. He felt energized. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd expected. His father was predictable in his rage, conventional in his response, and that predictability would be his downfall. In his chambers, Alexander found someone already waiting, his younger sister, Princess Elena. At 23, she was the rebel of the family. Though she hid it better than he did, that was either very brave or very stupid, she said, rising from his desk where she'd been reading. "Both," Alexander admitted, touching his swelling cheek. "But necessary. Father will never change," Elena said sadly. "You know this." "I'm not trying to change him," Alexander replied, moving to the window that overlooked the city beyond the palace walls. "I'm trying to change everything else." Elena joined him at the window. "You have a plan." It wasn't a question. She knew her brother too well. The confrontation in the throne room was just the beginning, Alexander confirmed. "Father thinks he's put me in my place by confining me to my chambers. But walls can't contain ideas. And I've already planted seeds." 40 planted. "With whom?" Elena asked, though she suspected she knew. "Lord Marquess of the Northern Provinces, General Thorne of the Royal Army, Minister Blackwood of the Treasury, and others. They all see what I see. That Valdoria cannot continue on this path. You're talking about—" Elena couldn't finish the sentence. "Reform," Alexander said firmly. "Not revolution. I don't want to destroy the monarchy. I want to save it. But Father's way will lead to uprising eventually. The people won't tolerate oppression forever. And if Father finds out about your allies?" Alexander smiled grimly. "He already suspects. Why do you think he was so angry? He knows I didn't travel alone. He knows I have support. But he doesn't know how much, or from whom exactly." A knock at the door interrupted them. "Enter," Alexander called. To his surprise, it was his mother, Queen Isabella. She rarely visited her children's chambers, preferring to maintain royal distance. "Mother," both siblings said, bowing slightly. Isabella studied her son's face, noting the red mark from the king's hand. That was foolish, Alexander, but necessary, he repeated. The queen moved closer, her elaborate gown rustling with each step. Your father is not an evil man. He rules, as he was taught to rule, as his father did before him. And that's the problem, Alexander said gently. The world has changed, but the throne hasn't. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, she said, I know. Both siblings stared at their mother in shock. You think I'm blind to what happens beyond these walls? Isabella continued. I was not born royal, remember? I was the daughter of a duke. I've seen both worlds. And I've watched the gap between them grow wider every year. Then why don't you speak to father? Elena asked. Because he doesn't listen to anyone, Isabella replied sadly. Not even me. Especially not me. He sees advice as weakness, compromise as failure. It will be his downfall. Quote, help us, Alexander said suddenly. You have influence, connections father doesn't monitor as closely. Isabella shook her head. I cannot openly defy my husband and king. Then don't do it openly, Alexander pressed. Just don't stand in our way. The queen looked at her children, so young, so idealistic, so determined. She saw in them the hope she had lost years ago. I will not help you, she said carefully. But I will not hinder you either. And perhaps I might occasionally leave certain doors unlocked, or certain conversations unheard. It was more than Alexander had dared hope for. After the queen left, Elena turned to her brother. This is dangerous. If we fail, Valdoria falls anyway, Alexander interrupted. Just more slowly. Father's authority is already shaking. Did you see the courtiers' faces today? Some of them wanted to applaud when I stood up to him. Lord Chancellor Reginald will be watching you now, Elena warned. Let him watch. He'll see exactly what I want him to see. A chastised prince, confined to his chambers, learning his lesson, while in reality, Alexander smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had been planning for a very long time. While in reality, the seeds of change have already been planted. Father's violent response today just watered them. Every harsh word, every display of inflexibility, every reminder of absolute authority, it all feeds the growing desire for something different. Elena studied her brother. When did you become so calculating? When I realized that honor and duty aren't enough, Alexander replied. Sometimes you need strategy. Sometimes you need to play the long game. As night fell over the palace, Alexander stood at his window, looking out at the kingdom he hoped to one day lead. Somewhere in those streets, people were talking about what had happened in the throne room. Servants whispered to merchants, merchants whispered to farmers, and the story grew with each telling. The prince who stood up to the king, the son who demanded reform, the heir who cared more about people than protocol. By morning, the story would have spread throughout the capital. By week's end, it would reach the furthest provinces. And King Leopold, in his fury and pride, had no idea that his harsh response had just made his son a hero to the people who mattered most, the citizens of Valdoria. In his own chambers, King Leopold stood at a similar window, looking out at the same view, but seeing something entirely different. Where Alexander saw potential for change, Leopold saw a kingdom that needed firm control. Where Alexander saw suffering that needed relief, Leopold saw order that needed maintaining. He's too much like his grandfather, Leopold muttered to the darkness. Lord Chancellor Reginald, who had followed the king from the throne room, nodded agreement. Prince Edward was also prone to progressive ideas. And look where it got him, Leopold said bitterly. Dead at 40, with the kingdom in chaos. It took me years to restore order after his experiments with reform. Your Majesty's wisdom prevailed then, as it will now, Reginald said smoothly. But Leopold wasn't entirely reassured. He had seen something in Alexander's eyes today. Not just defiance, but certainty. The boy truly believed he was right. That made him dangerous. Double the guards on his chambers, Leopold ordered. Monitor all visitors. I want to know everyone he speaks with, every letter he receives or sends. It will be done, Your Majesty. And Reginald? Find out who helped him during his travels. Someone must have aided him, sheltered him. I want names. As the Chancellor bowed and left, Leopold remained at the window. He had ruled through strength and tradition for 35 years. He would not let an idealistic boy undo everything he had built. But even as he thought this, doubt crept in like frost on glass. The court's reaction today had been unexpected. Where was the immediate condemnation of Alexander's boldness? Where was the unified support for their king? Leopold shook off the doubt. He was king. His word was law. And tomorrow, he would remind everyone, including his son, exactly what that meant. 3 days passed in tense silence. The palace seemed to hold its breath, waiting for King Leopold's next move. But the king did nothing. At least, nothing visible. This worried Alexander more than any immediate punishment would have. From his window, Alexander watched the palace guards change shifts with clockwork precision. Double the usual number, as he'd expected. His father was nothing if not predictable. What Leopold didn't know was that among those guards were 2 men whose families Alexander had personally helped during his travels. They kept him informed of everything happening beyond his locked doors. A soft knock interrupted his observations. "Your meal, Your Highness," came a servant's voice. "Enter," Alexander called. The servant who entered was new. A young woman with clever eyes named Marie. As she set down the tray, she stumbled slightly, dropping a napkin. When Alexander bent to retrieve it, he found a small note tucked inside. After Marie left, Alexander unfolded the note. It was from Lord Marcus. "The northern provinces stand ready. Await your signal. The king plans something for tomorrow's court session." Alexander burned the note immediately. So his father was finally making his move. Good. The waiting had been the hardest part. That evening, Princess Elena visited again, using the secret passage they'd discovered as children. The guards outside Alexander's official door had no idea she came and went freely. "Father has summoned the full court for tomorrow," she reported. "Every noble within a day's ride has been commanded to attend. He plans to make an example of me," Alexander concluded. "Public humiliation. Probably disinheritance." "Aling, aren't you worried?" Alexander smiled. "I'm counting on it. Father's greatest weakness is his need for absolute control. He has to crush any challenge completely and publicly, but in doing so, he reveals his own fear. You're playing a dangerous game, brother." "It's not a game," Alexander replied seriously. "Lives hang in the balance. Did you deliver the messages?" Elena nodded. "Lord Marcus, General Thorne, Minister Blackwood, they all know to be ready. Lady Catherine has also been spreading word among the younger nobles. Support is growing, but Alexander, many are still afraid." "Fear can be overcome," Alexander said, "but only when people see that change is possible. Tomorrow, they'll see." Meanwhile, in the royal chambers, Queen Isabella sat at her mirror while her ladies prepared her for bed. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying a conversation from earlier that day. King Leopold had been in rare form, ranting about Alexander's defiance. "He thinks he knows better than centuries of tradition," the king had snarled. "He thinks compassion can rule a kingdom. Perhaps a small measure of compassion wouldn't hurt," Isabella had suggested carefully. Leopold had turned on her with such fury that she'd actually stepped back. "Not you two," he'd said coldly. "I thought at least my wife understood the burden of the crown." "I understand the burden of rigidity," Isabella had replied, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. "I understand the cost of ruling through fear rather than respect." The king had dismissed her then, as he always did when she disagreed with him. But Isabella had seen something in his eyes. A flicker of uncertainty. For the first time in their marriage, Leopold looked old, tired. perhaps even afraid. Now, as her ladies departed, Isabella made a decision. She couldn't openly support Alexander, but she could ensure certain people were present at tomorrow's gathering, people whose voices might matter when the moment came. The next morning dawned gray and oppressive, matching the mood in the palace. Nobles arrived throughout the early hours, filling the throne room to capacity. Many had traveled through the night, understanding that a royal summons brooked no delay. Alexander was escorted to the throne room by 6 guards. Excessive for one unarmed prince. But his father was making a point. As he entered, conversations ceased. All eyes turned to him. He noticed immediately how the room was arranged. His supporters were scattered, separated by those loyal to the king. Strategic. Leopold had done his homework, but Alexander also noticed something his father might have missed. The number of neutral faces. Nobles who hadn't yet chosen a side. They were the ones who mattered today. King Leopold sat on his throne like a statue carved from judgment itself. Queen Isabella sat beside him, her face carefully neutral. The Lord Chancellor stood ready with what appeared to be official documents. Prince Alexander, the king began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. You stand accused of sedition, of undermining royal authority, and of conduct unbecoming of a prince of Valdoria. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sedition was a serious charge, even for a prince. Alexander stood tall. I stand accused of caring about our people's welfare. If that is sedition, then I am guilty. Silence, Leopold commanded. You will speak only when permitted. He nodded to Lord Chancellor Reginald. The Chancellor unrolled a parchment. Your Highness, during your unauthorized travels, you met with known dissidents, promised reforms without authority, and encouraged unrest among the populace. Do you deny these charges? I deny encouraging unrest, Alexander replied clearly. I encouraged hope. There's a difference. You exceeded your authority, Reginald pressed. You made promises you had no right to make. I made no promises, Alexander countered. I listened. Something the crown has forgotten how to do. Number 4. King Leopold stood abruptly. Enough of this wordplay. You want to help the people? Then you should understand sacrifice. Lord Chancellor, read the decree. Reginald produced another parchment, this one bearing the royal seal. By order of His Majesty, King Leopold, of Valdoria, Prince Alexander, is hereby stripped of his primary inheritance rights. He shall no longer be considered first in line for the throne. This position shall pass to— Wait! A voice rang out from the crowd. General Thorne stepped forward, his medals gleaming. Your Majesty, I beg your indulgence. Leopold's eyes narrowed. General Thorne, you dare interrupt royal proceedings? I dare speak the truth, Your Majesty, Thorne replied, his military bearing evident. Prince Alexander saved my nephew's life during his travels. The boy was wrongly imprisoned for a debt his dead father owed. The prince paid the debt from his own funds and secured the boy's release. He asked for nothing in return. Didn't even reveal his identity until after. That has no bearing on, the king began. With respect, Your Majesty. It has every bearing. Lord Marcus stepped forward next. The northern provinces have suffered 3 harsh winters. Prince Alexander personally helped organize food distribution, again using his own resources. He could have simply sent gold and stayed comfortable in the palace. Instead, he worked alongside us, understanding our struggles. He gave my daughter hope. A minor noble called out. She was ill, couldn't afford proper medicine. The prince ensured she received treatment. More voices joined in, each sharing a story of Alexander's kindness during his travels. The carefully controlled proceedings were slipping from Leopold's grasp. Silence! The king roared. These anecdotes change nothing. The prince defied royal authority. That cannot stand. Then perhaps royal authority needs examining. A clear voice said. Everyone turned to see Queen Isabella rising from her throne. Leopold stared at his wife in shock. "My queen," he said warningly. "My king," she replied calmly. "For 25 years, I have sat beside you, supported you, remained silent when I disagreed, but I cannot remain silent when you punish our son for possessing the very qualities a true king needs: compassion, humility, and the courage to see beyond palace walls." The throne room erupted in whispers. The queen never spoke at formal proceedings. This was unprecedented. "You forget yourself, Isabella," Leopold said, his voice dangerous. "No, Leopold. I remember myself. I remember the young duke's daughter, who married a prince full of promise. I remember believing we would rule with both strength and kindness. But somewhere, you lost the kindness, keeping only the strength. And strength without compassion is merely tyranny." Alexander watched his mother with amazement. He had never seen her like this. Regal, powerful, unafraid. "You would side with him against me?" Leopold asked. And for the first time, his voice held something other than anger. It held hurt. "I side with Valdoria," Isabella replied. "As should we all." The king stood frozen, his world tilting. His wife's defiance. Following his sons. Following the growing murmur of support for Alexander. It was all wrong. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Minister Blackwood stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may, the Treasury reports show that provinces where Prince Alexander intervened have shown marked improvement in tax collection, not because rates were raised, but because people could actually afford to pay. His methods, however unorthodox, have proven effective. You too, Blackwood?" Leopold's voice was hollow now. Lady Catherine, young and usually timid, found her voice. "Your Majesty, we of the younger generation see Prince Alexander as our future. Not because he defies you, but because he sees us. He understands that the world is changing whether we acknowledge it or not." Alexander seized the moment. "Father, I don't seek to destroy what you've built. I seek to evolve it. The foundation you've created is strong. That's why it can bear reform without crumbling. Work with me, not against me. Let us show the world that Valdoria can honor its past while embracing its future." Leopold looked around the room, seeing the faces of his court. Many still supported him, would always support the crown. But others, more than he had expected, were looking at Alexander with hope. When had he lost them? When had his absolute authority become something to be questioned rather than accepted? "You ask me to share power," Leopold said slowly. "To admit that my way is not the only way. I ask you to be the king I know you can be," Alexander replied. "The king who puts Valdoria first, always. The king who is strong enough to change." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then, unexpectedly, Leopold laughed. It was a bitter sound, full of irony. "You manipulated this entire scene," the king said. "The confrontation 3 days ago. The public spectacle today. You planned it all." "I learned from the best," Alexander replied simply. Leopold studied his son with new eyes. The boy, no, the man, before him had outmaneuvered him. Not through force or betrayal, but through patience and planning. It was exactly what Leopold would have done in his position. "You have your mother's compassion," Leopold said finally. "But you have my cunning, a dangerous combination." He turned to face the full court. "I came here today to punish defiance. But perhaps defiance born of love for one's kingdom is not something to punish but to harness." The king sat back down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 60 years. "Lord Chancellor, burn that decree," Reginald hesitated. "Your Majesty? You heard me. Burn it." Leopold's voice regained some strength. "Prince Alexander will retain his position as heir. More than that," he paused, the word seeming to physically pain him. "Prince Alexander will chair a new royal council on reform. He will have authority to propose changes to our governance, working with Minister Blackwood, General Thorne, and others he deems necessary. All proposals must still receive royal approval, but they will receive fair consideration. The throne room erupted. Some cheered, others muttered disapproval, but the energy was undeniable. Change, real change, was possible. Alexander bowed deeply to his father. "You honor me, Your Majesty. I will not disappoint you." "You already have disappointed me," Leopold replied. But there was something almost like pride in his voice. "But perhaps disappointment is sometimes necessary for growth." None. Queen Isabella moved to stand between her husband and son, taking each by the hand. "Valdoria is strongest when its royal family stands united. Let this be a new beginning, not just for us, but for our kingdom." As the court session ended and nobles dispersed, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The old guard muttered about dangerous precedents, while younger voices spoke excitedly of possibilities. Alexander found himself surrounded by supporters, all eager to contribute to the reforms, but he noticed his father had remained on the throne, alone now, except for the queen. Leopold looked diminished somehow, as if sharing power had physically reduced him. Alexander excused himself from his supporters and approached the throne. "Father?" Leopold looked up, and for the first time in years, Alexander saw vulnerability in those gray eyes. "I built my entire reign on absolute authority," Leopold said quietly. "It's all I knew, all I was taught. Your grandfather's reforms nearly destroyed us. I saw weakness in any compromise, danger in any change. But you changed today," Alexander pointed out. "Because you forced me to see what I had refused to see," Leopold admitted. "When your mother stood against me, when voices I trusted spoke for you, I realized I had become the very thing I swore to prevent. A king so rigid that he would break rather than bend." "You're not broken," Alexander said firmly. "You're evolving. That takes more strength than rigidity ever could." Leopold studied his son. "You really believe these reforms will work? That we can change without losing ourselves?" "I believe we'll lose ourselves if we don't change," Alexander replied. "The world moves forward, with or without us. Better to lead that movement than be crushed by it." The king nodded slowly. "Then lead, my son. But carefully. Change too fast, and you'll face the same resistance I showed. Every reform must be measured, its effects considered. Promise me that." "I promise," Alexander said. "We'll move at a pace the kingdom can accept. No revolution, just evolution. And promise me something else," Leopold added. "When you are king, and you will be king sooner than you might think, for I find I'm tired in ways rest cannot cure. Remember this day. Remember that even the most absolute authority can be wrong. Don't become me, Alexander. Be better." It was the closest to an apology Alexander would ever receive from his father. And it was enough. That evening, as celebrations quietly spread through the progressive members of court and into the city beyond, Alexander stood once again at his window. But now, he was not alone. Elena, his mother, and surprisingly, his father, joined him. "Look," Leopold said, pointing to the streets where people had begun gathering. Word of the reforms spreading like wildfire. "They celebrate as if we've already solved their problems." "They celebrate hope," Isabella corrected gently. "For the first time in years, they have hope." "Then we must not disappoint them," Alexander said. "We," Leopold repeated. "I suppose I must grow accustomed to that word." He paused, then added with dry humor, "Though I draw the line at calling meetings, collaborative discussions, or some such modern nonsense." Elena laughed, the first genuine laughter heard in the royal chambers for far too long. "Small steps, father, small steps." As the royal family stood together, watching their kingdom pulse with new energy, each knew that the hardest work lay ahead. Reform was easier to promise than to deliver. There would be setbacks, resistance, failures, but for tonight, hope was enough. In the shadows of the throne room, Lord Chancellor Reginald watched the royal family with calculating eyes. He had served Leopold faithfully for 2 decades, had built his power on the king's absolute authority. This new world of shared power and reform threatened everything he had worked for. "This isn't over," he murmured to himself. "The prince may have won this battle, but the war for Valdoria's soul has just begun." He slipped away to his chambers, where letters waited to be written. If the royal family thought change would come easily, they were about to learn otherwise. Reginald had allies too. Nobles who profited from the current system. Ministers who feared losing their influence. Guards more loyal to gold than to ideals. Prince Alexander had shaken the palace today, but palaces, Reginald knew, had a way of shaking back. 6 months had passed since that pivotal day in the throne room, and the kingdom of Valdoria hummed with change. But change, Alexander was learning, was like trying to redirect a river. Possible, but requiring constant vigilance against the old course, reasserting itself. In the council chamber, Alexander sat surrounded by papers, proposals, and the ever-present weight of expectation. The Royal Council on Reform had achieved more than anyone had expected. Taxes had been restructured, making them fairer, while actually increasing revenue as people could afford to pay. New schools were being built in rural provinces. Trade routes had been modernized. Yet for every success, there seemed to be 2 new challenges. "The Nobles' Alliance is blocking the land reform proposal again," Minister Blackwood reported wearily. He had aged visibly in these months, fighting battles in ledgers and legislation rather than on fields of valor. "Lord Chancellor Reginald's doing." "No doubt," General Thorne growled. The military man had become one of Alexander's most trusted advisors, his straightforward approach cutting through political doublespeak. Alexander rubbed his temples. "What's their excuse this time? They claim redistributing unused noble lands to farmers will undermine the historical fabric of our society." Blackwood read from the formal complaint. "They mean it will undermine their ability to charge rent for land they never use," Lady Catherine interjected. She had proven surprisingly astute in these meetings, her youth balanced by sharp intelligence. A knock at the door interrupted their discussion. Princess Elena entered, her face grave. "Alexander, father has collapsed." The council chamber emptied in seconds as they rushed to the royal chambers. They found King Leopold in bed, his face gray but his eyes still sharp. Queen Isabella sat beside him, holding his hand. "Don't look so worried," Leopold said weakly. "I'm not dead yet." "Father, you should rest," Alexander began. "I'll have eternity to rest soon enough," Leopold cut him off. "The physicians tell me my heart is failing. Too many years of stress, they say. Too many years of carrying the kingdom alone." He looked meaningfully at Alexander. "Don't make my mistake." Over the following days, Leopold's condition worsened. The kingdom held its breath, caught between grief for a long-serving king and uncertainty about the future. It was during this time that Lord Chancellor Reginald made his move. Alexander was returning from his father's bedside when guards blocked his path. Not his guards, but men wearing the Chancellor's colors. "Lord Chancellor Reginald requests your presence, Your Highness," one said. The way he said requests made it clear refusal wasn't an option. Alexander found Reginald in the throne room, standing before the empty throne with a document in his hand. 24 nobles stood behind him, the core of the resistance to reform. "Ah, Prince Alexander," Reginald said smoothly. "So good of you to join us." "What is this, Reginald?" "This," the Chancellor held up the document, "is a petition signed by 40% of the noble houses. It calls for a regency council to rule when your father passes. Given your inexperience," Alexander felt ice in his veins. A regency would strip him of power just when the reforms were gaining momentum. "The law is clear. I am heir." "The law also allows for a regency if the nobility questions the heir's readiness," Reginald smiled coldly. "Your radical policies have given many pause. Perhaps a period of guidance would be beneficial." "You mean a period where you can undo everything we've achieved," Alexander said flatly. "We seek only stability," Lord Blackstone, one of Reginald's allies, interjected. "These reforms move too fast. The kingdom needs steady hands that have picked the kingdom's pockets for generations," Alexander shot back. Reginald's smile widened. Such inflammatory language, hardly befitting a future king. Unless, of course, you weren't to be king at all. The regency could last indefinitely. Before Alexander could respond, the throne room doors burst open. General Thorne entered with a contingent of royal guards. The real royal guard, not Reginald's men. "What's the meaning of this?" Reginald demanded. But it was Queen Isabella who answered, sweeping into the room with more authority than she'd shown in 25 years of marriage. "The meaning, Lord Chancellor, is that you've overplayed your hand." Behind her came more nobles. But these supported Alexander. Lord Marcus, Minister Blackwood, Lady Catherine, and dozens of others who had benefited from or believed in the reforms. "You have 40%, Isabella continued, addressing Reginald. "We have 60. Your petition fails." Reginald's face contorted with rage. "You dare. I dare protect my son and my kingdom," Isabella cut him off. "Did you think I would sit idle while you schemed?" "I may have been silent for years, but I was never blind." Alexander looked at his mother with new respect. She had been organizing support while he fought public battles. The quiet queen had become a political force. Furthermore, Isabella produced a document of her own. "I have here evidence of your personal corruption, Lord Chancellor. Skimming from the treasury, selling positions, accepting bribes to influence royal policy. My husband tolerated it because you were useful. But your usefulness has ended." The nobles behind Reginald began to shift nervously. Supporting a political position was one thing. Supporting a criminal was another. "You can't prove," Reginald began. "Actually, I can," a new voice said. Marie, the servant who had passed Alexander messages, entered carrying a box of documents. "I've been in your service for 2 years, Lord Chancellor. You never noticed me. Never thought a servant could be more than furniture. But I noticed everything. Every bribe. Every secret meeting. Every treasonous word." Alexander stepped forward. "Lord Chancellor Reginald, you are under arrest for corruption and attempted treason. You don't have the authority." "He does." King Leopold's voice, though weak, carried absolute authority. The king entered, supported by 2 guards, but standing on his own power. The effort was clearly costing him, but his presence changed everything. "I hereby grant Prince Alexander full royal authority as regent, effective immediately. My son speaks with my voice." The throne room fell silent. Leopold had just done what no Valdorian king had done in centuries. Voluntarily shared supreme power. Reginald looked around desperately, but his support was evaporating. Faced with the united royal family and evidence of his crimes, even his allies abandoned him. "Take him away," Alexander commanded, and the guards moved to comply. As Reginald was led out, he turned back with venom in his eyes. "You think you've won? You'll destroy everything that makes Valdoria great. The people will curse your name when your reforms fail." "Perhaps," Alexander acknowledged, "but at least I'll have tried to build rather than steal." After Reginald was removed, Leopold collapsed into a chair, his strength finally spent. Alexander knelt beside him. "Father, you shouldn't have come." "Your health?" "My health is forfeit," Leopold said quietly. "But my kingdom, our kingdom, that will endure. You've proven yourself, my son, not through force or fear, but through patience and wisdom. You'll be a better king than I ever was." Number 5. 3 days later, King Leopold of Valdoria passed peacefully in his sleep. His last words were to Alexander. "Bend. Don't break. And remember, even reformers need reforming sometimes." The coronation of King Alexander was unlike any in Valdorian history. Instead of just nobles filling the cathedral, representatives from every level of society were invited. Farmers stood beside merchants, teachers beside soldiers, all united in witnessing the dawn of a new era. As the crown was placed on Alexander's head, he thought of the journey that had brought him here. From that first confrontation in the throne room to this moment, every challenge had shaped him. tested him, prepared him. Do you, Alexander, swear to rule Valdoria with justice and wisdom, to protect all citizens regardless of station, to honor the past while building the future? I do so swear, Alexander replied, and meant every word. Queen Isabella, now Queen Mother, smiled with pride. Elena, promoted to Princess Royal and Alexander's chief advisor, nodded encouragingly. Even the nobles who had opposed reform seemed cautiously optimistic. The evidence of the past 6 months was hard to argue with. The kingdom was prospering in ways it hadn't for decades. In his first address as king, Alexander spoke not from the throne, but standing among his people. Today marks not my triumph, but our beginning, he said. The reforms we've started are just the foundation. There will be setbacks, disagreements, failures, but we will face them together. Noble and common, rich and poor, as one Valdoria. The cheers that erupted weren't just polite court approval but genuine celebration from people who finally felt heard, seen, valued. Later that evening, in the private royal chambers, Alexander stood at the same window where he had planned his challenge to his father's authority. But now, instead of looking out with frustration, he gazed with hope. Elena joined him, as she always did, in important moments. Regrets? None, Alexander replied. Father was right about one thing. Power isn't given. It's earned. But he was wrong about how to earn it. It's not through fear or tradition alone, but through trust and progress. Lord Chancellor Reginald's trial begins next week, Elena reminded him. His supporters are scattered but not gone. They'll regroup eventually. Let them, Alexander said calmly. Opposition keeps us honest, prevents us from becoming complacent. The moment we stop listening to dissent is the moment we become what we fought against. A knock at the door revealed General Thorne. Your Majesty, the first graduates from the new rural schools are requesting an audience. They want to thank you personally. Alexander smiled. Show them in. A king's first duty is to his people. As he prepared to meet these young citizens whose lives had been changed by reform, Alexander reflected on his father's final lesson. Leopold had been right. Even reformers need reforming sometimes. Power, whether absolute or shared, required constant vigilance against corruption and complacency. But for now, Valdoria was moving forward. The bold demand that had once met cold royal authority had transformed both the demanded and the authority. The palace that had been shaken by a prince's defiance now stood stronger for having learned to bend. In the chronicles of Valdorian history, the reign of King Alexander would be remembered as the Great Transformation, not because change came easily or without cost, but because a prince dared to demand better, a king found strength in surrender, and a kingdom discovered that tradition and progress could dance together rather than battle. The servant Marie, rewarded for her crucial role in exposing Reginald, became the first common-born member of the Royal Intelligence Service. She would later write in her memoirs, "The prince who stood up to absolute power became the king who shared it. In doing so, he didn't weaken the crown. He made it unbreakable." General Thorne continued to serve as military advisor, modernizing Valdoria's forces while maintaining their proud traditions. His nephew, the one Alexander had saved, became one of the kingdom's finest physicians, dedicated to bringing healthcare to the poorest provinces. Lady Catherine married for love rather than politics, a freedom the new social reforms allowed, and established the kingdom's first university open to all citizens, regardless of birth or wealth. Minister Blackwood revolutionized the treasury, creating a system so transparent that corruption became nearly impossible. Queen Mother Isabella spent her remaining years traveling the kingdom she had once only seen from palace windows. Her journals became required reading in schools, teaching young Valdorians about the courage required not just to rule, but to change. Princess Elena eventually married a brilliant commoner who had risen through the new merit-based system. Their children would grow up in a Valdoria where birthright mattered less than dedication, where the palace gates stood open rather than closed. And King Alexander? He ruled for 43 years, facing countless challenges, making mistakes, learning, adapting. He married a woman who challenged him as much as supported him, a merchant's daughter whose intelligence and compassion matched his own. Together, they raised children who understood that crowns were tools of service, not symbols of superiority. On the anniversary of that first confrontation, Alexander would always spend the day among his people, listening to their concerns, celebrating their successes, remembering that authority without compassion was merely tyranny, but compassion without authority was merely wishes. The bold demand had indeed been met with cold royal authority. But from that collision of wills had come something neither demanded nor authority had expected. Wisdom. The wisdom to know when to stand firm and when to bend, when to lead and when to listen, when to honor the past and when to build the future. The palace had been shaken, yes. But sometimes, it takes an earthquake to reveal the strongest foundations and clear ground for new growth. In the end, both the demander and the authority discovered they were stronger together than either had been alone. Valdoria thrived, not because it had a perfect king or perfect systems, but because it had learned the most important lesson of all. True strength lay not in never changing, but in having the courage to transform when transformation was needed. And in the great throne room, where a prince had once defied a king, children now learned about government. Citizens voiced their concerns directly to their leaders, and the throne itself stood not as a symbol of absolute power, but as a reminder that all power, in the end, came from and belonged to the people. The revolution that had never quite happened had achieved more than any violent uprising could have. It had changed hearts and minds, systems and traditions, creating a kingdom where hope was policy, not just promise, as histories would record. Thus ended the age of absolute monarchy in Valdoria. Not with the fall of a king, but with the rise of one who understood that the greatest authority comes from knowing when to share it. The bold demand had been met, the cold authority warmed, and from their meeting, a kingdom was reborn.